Hey guys, welcome back. And go ahead and dim the lights, because tonight we're drifting slowly, very slowly, into the cheerfully miserable world of medieval medicine. The kind where your doctor might have shown up with a beak strapped to his face, a stick in one hand, and a contract demanding free housing in the other. So settle in, make some tea if you want, and try not to imagine the smell of 14th century Europe, because yes, it was exactly as bad as you think. Now, the plague, also called the Black Death by people with a sense of poetic flair, arrived in 1347, hitchhiking on fleas, who were hitchhiking on rats, who were hitchhiking on ships, basically a chain of unwanted passengers turning up to ruin everything, and ruin everything they did, because the plague gave you a fever, some lovely vomiting, enormous lumps called buboes, and then usually a funeral within the week. So, naturally, medieval people panicked in the way medieval people did best. They blamed the planets, or the weather, or God's bad mood, while also inventing the job of the plague doctor, those famous bird-masked fellows wandering through paintings like budget grim reapers with a day job. The masks, as it turns out, were stuffed with herbs and flowers because doctors believed the plague came from miasma, or bad air. So, if the air smelled nice, obviously it couldn't kill you. Science at its finest. So picture this. Your village is falling apart, your neighbor just stopped breathing, and here comes this tall man in a black leather coat, his face replaced by a giant bird's beak, poking your uncle with a stick from 3 feet away because social distancing is apparently medieval now, and you think, yes, this is definitely the man who will save us. Except half the time he wasn't even a real doctor. Sometimes he was just a guy desperate enough to take the job, because real physicians, the university ones with their Latin degrees and smug faces, either fled or sat in libraries writing books blaming Saturn for the plague instead of actually treating it. While the plague doctors, often paid very well in advance because job security wasn't exactly a selling point here, wandered around lancing buboes, keeping records, and handing out treatments that ranged from slightly helpful to please stop drinking ground-up emeralds, this is not medicine. All while negotiating contracts that demanded salaries, food allowances, free lodging, and occasionally a cut of the inheritance from patients who inconveniently died without heirs, because nothing says health care like your doctor eyeing the family silver. And the best part is, even though their outfits looked terrifying, the fancy university doctors still looked down on them, considered them second-rate freelancers with better costumes than qualifications. And the irony here is delicious, because the university doctors had no better ideas themselves, they just charged more for being wrong in Latin. But here's the twist. The famous plague doctor outfit, the one everyone pictures, probably didn't even exist during the first big outbreak. It came later, in the 1600s, designed by a French physician named Charles Delorme, who gave us the full leather getup, the boots, gloves, hat, and the now iconic bird beak stuffed with herbs. And while it did absolutely nothing about germs, which no one knew existed, it probably kept out a few fleas and created some accidental social distancing. So, congratulations to him for inventing protective gear entirely by mistake. Meanwhile, medieval people had very mixed feelings about plague doctors. Some thought they were brave. Others thought they were omens of death. Children were terrified of them. And honestly, who can blame them? Because if a giant leather bird man walked into my house carrying a stick and muttering about bad air, I too would reconsider my will. And through all of this, the treatments got weirder. Vinegar baths, flower garlands, avoiding sad thoughts, moving to higher ground because death apparently hated climbing hills. And yet, some doctors genuinely tried, recording symptoms, suggesting quarantines, even noticing patterns in how the disease spread. But the sad fact is that most of them died anyway, costumes and all. So towns kept hiring replacements, each one less qualified than the last, until by the end of some outbreaks, plague doctor basically meant guy still willing to show up. And when the plague finally moved on, the survivors packed up their bird masks, collected their salaries, and left town, with a fascinating mix of trauma and new real estate holdings, while later generations, especially artists and writers, turned them into symbols of the whole era, part healer, part death omen, part tragic comedy in leather, which is probably why the costume keeps showing up in movies, novels, and Halloween parties today, because nothing says medieval Europe like a man in a bird mask pretending not to be terrified while poking corpses with a stick. And with that very comforting image in mind, let's drift onward to meet some actual plague doctors by name,
Because yes, a few survived long enough to leave behind records, contracts, and stories that tell us whether they were brave professionals, total frauds, or just really committed side hustlers with questionable fashion sense.
So, let's settle in and meet a few of these brave or possibly just underemployed souls who signed on to be plague doctors. Because, yes, some names survive, usually buried in contracts or letters where they were busy negotiating hazard pay while everyone around them was busy dying. And one of the earliest known plague doctors was a man named Giovanni de Ventura, hired in the city of Pavia in 1479, which was having one of those years where the phrase population decline was less about economics and more about funerals. And his contract, because of course there was one, spelled out that he would treat plague victims, keep meticulous records, avoid overcharging grieving families, a low bar but at least someone thought to include it, and in return he would be paid a decent salary with lodging, travel expenses, and sometimes immunity from certain taxes or lawsuits, because yes, medieval cities understood that if you wanted someone to walk into a plague pit with a stick and a bag of herbs, you had to sweeten the deal, though survival was not actually guaranteed in the fine print. Another famous doctor, Michel de Nostredame, yes, that Nostradamus before he became the world's least specific psychic, worked in plague-stricken France in the 1500s, handing out his own herbal remedies, avoiding bloodletting like the plague itself, pun fully intended, and allegedly surviving long enough to later write cryptic poetry about future disasters, proving that sometimes your career path can veer wildly from plague guy to mystical bestseller if you just live through enough pandemics. And then there was Charles Delarme, the French court physician we mentioned earlier, serving King Louis XIII and a few other royals, while inventing the now iconic leather bird outfit in the 1600s, because if you're going to treat smallpox-covered monarchs and plague-stricken peasants alike, you might as well do it dressed like a murderous stork. And Delarme apparently believed strongly in protecting himself with layers of waxed leather, gloves, boots, hat, and of course the beak stuffed with rosemary, camphor, and myrrh, creating the world's first hazmat suit designed by someone who still thought bad air was out to get him. But hey, he lived to a respectable age, so maybe the beak helped after all. Or maybe he just avoided getting sneezed on, which in the 1600s was basically the same as practicing modern medicine. Meanwhile, most contracts for plague doctors read like a bizarre mix of healthcare plan and real estate deal. The city would pay a lump sum, often in advance because, again, plague doctors had a rather short life expectancy, and in return the doctor promised to visit the sick, not abandon the town mid-outbreak, a common problem, and sometimes even agreed to stay celibate during his term of service, because apparently someone thought romance might be distracting from corpse-poking duties. Though honestly, if you're wandering medieval streets in a bird mask during the apocalypse, I'm guessing your dating life isn't exactly thriving anyway. And what's truly delightful is that some plague doctors were hired not by cities, but by villages, pooling resources, scraping together whatever coins and chickens they could manage to bring in someone willing to prescribe vinegar baths and herbal fumigation while keeping careful death tolls in neat handwriting. Because record-keeping was apparently as important as curing anything. And you can almost hear the medieval town council saying, "Sure, everyone's dying, but let's at least have accurate paperwork about it," which is why we know about these men at all, since so many were required to leave behind reports on what treatments they used, how many patients died, and whether they personally managed to survive long enough to collect the rest of their salary. But here's the thing, plague doctors weren't always locals. And in fact, cities often hired outsiders deliberately because residents didn't want to treat their own neighbors. Understandable, really. So, a wandering doctor might arrive from 2 towns over, sign a contract for 6 months, wear the beak, poke some corpses, and then vanish over the horizon once the plague moved on, hopefully richer, possibly traumatized, and usually with a reputation ranging anywhere from heroic healer
to that guy who charged us a fortune and told us to burn lavender while half the village died anyway. Because medieval Yelp reviews, if they existed, would have been brutal. And all of this created a fascinating economy around death itself. Doctors negotiating hazard pay, cities competing to hire the few willing professionals, families bribing physicians for extra visits, while undertakers, coffin makers, and grave diggers enjoyed what historians delicately call periods of increased demand. So plague doctors weren't just medical figures, they were part of a whole grim industry that thrived whenever disease rolled through town, and whether they were heroes or opportunists often depended less on what they did than on whether they survived long enough to spend their paychecks, because many didn't, and their contracts sometimes include heartbreaking clauses about paying salaries to surviving relatives if the doctor himself ended up buried in the mass graves he was hired to prevent filling quite so quickly, which, you have to admit, is both sensible and very, very bleak. And yet through all this, some plague doctors clearly tried their best, lancing buboes, recommending quarantines, even noting that cleaner water and fewer rats might help. Tiny glimmers of real medical thought centuries before germ theory turned up to explain what was actually happening. So while many were absolutely in it for the money, others left behind observations that helped later generations slowly, painfully crawl toward modern public health. Though, of course, at the time, no one wanted to hear about rats and fleas when it was so much easier to blame bad air, divine wrath, or that suspicious-looking family down the road, because medieval Europe loved a good scapegoat almost as much as it loved not washing its hands. And on that cheerful note, let's drift onward to look at some of the genuinely absurd treatments plague doctors prescribed with straight faces. Because if you thought the bird mask was weird, wait until you hear what they expected patients to actually swallow in the name of medicine.
So, now that we've met the bird-masked gentlemen themselves, let's relax and follow them into their treatment rooms, which were usually just people's homes, because medieval Europe didn't have hospitals in any modern sense. And here's where things get very entertaining, because plague doctors had an entire menu of remedies, and none of them, not one, worked the way they hoped, though that did not stop them from handing them out with complete confidence, since nothing says professional health care like staring at a patient covered in buboes and saying with a straight face, "Have you tried drinking molten gold?" And yes, that was an actual thing, because some medieval texts recommended swallowing precious metals in wine as a cure, and it went about as well as you'd expect, though at least it gave the undertakers something shiny to look at. Other popular treatments included rubbing onions, butter, or even pigeon carcasses on infected swellings, because apparently the humble pigeon was believed to draw out poison by simply sitting on your wounds like some sort of feathered sponge. And people really did this while their neighbors nodded approvingly, as though this was normal behavior and not a crime against birds everywhere. Then there was bloodletting, the all-time medieval favorite, because doctors thought plague came from bad blood, so obviously the answer was to drain some out, often with leeches, knives, or whatever sharp object was handy. And while this sometimes made patients lightheaded enough to forget they were dying, it did not, shockingly, cure the plague, though it did give the local barber surgeons plenty of side work between trimming beards and pulling teeth. And if you think that sounds grim, let's talk about fumigation, where doctors burned herbs, spices, or occasionally straight-up animal dung inside houses because the smoke was supposed to drive away the disease. And it probably drove away your remaining friends as well, since medieval homes already smelled like sadness before someone started lighting piles of manure in the corner. Other texts recommended bathing in rose water, vinegar, or even human urine. Yes, that made the list too, because apparently medieval people would try anything if someone in a bird mask told them it might help. And honestly, at this point, you can't even blame them, since no one had a better plan anyway. Meanwhile, some doctors leaned hard into astrology, calculating the positions of Saturn and Mars before recommending treatment, as though plague germs cared about your zodiac sign.
And when all else failed, many physicians suggested prayer, repentance, or whipping yourself in public processions to convince God to calm down. Because obviously nothing cures bacterial infections like hitting yourself with sticks while singing hymns. But perhaps the most ambitious cures came from the wealthy, who could afford exotic nonsense like powdered emeralds, crushed sapphires, or bezoar stones from goat stomachs dissolved in wine. Because if you were rich in the Middle Ages, apparently the goal was to die expensively, even if the plague didn't care how many jewels you swallowed on your way out. And through all this, plague doctors faithfully recorded their recipes, from floral potions to toad amulets tied around the neck, which were supposed to draw out poison because people believed toads were naturally toxic sponges. So somewhere out there was a medieval man wearing a live toad like jewelry while everyone nodded solemnly about the science of it all. One text even recommended applying a paste made from tree resin, flower petals, and, I kid you not, the crushed remains of a recently deceased patient, because someone apparently thought plague victims themselves contained the cure if you just redistributed them creatively. And if you're wondering how many people this saved, the answer is exactly 0, though it definitely gave the survivors something to gossip about. But what's truly fascinating is that amid all this chaos, a few doctors noticed things like fresh air, isolation, and cleaner surroundings seemed to help a little, leading to the earliest ideas about quarantine. Though most towns enforced it badly, with healthy people often locked in houses alongside the sick, because medieval public health was mostly just panic and hope for the best. Yet through all the herbal smokes, pigeon rubs, and jewel smoothies, the plague rolled on unaffected, wiping out entire neighborhoods, while doctors kept handing out recipes like medieval lifestyle influencers, insisting that yes, if you just burned enough rosemary while avoiding sad thoughts, everything would be fine. And on that note, let's drift quietly toward how the public actually reacted to these medical masterminds, because, spoiler alert, not everyone was impressed by the man in the bird mask selling perfume sachets as a survival strategy.
All right, let's keep drifting through the medieval fog in one long, sleepy paragraph, and now we'll look at what ordinary people actually thought about plague doctors. Because, spoiler alert, it wasn't all gratitude and fan mail. So settle in as we wander through medieval public opinion, which ranged from cautious respect to outright panic whenever the man in the beak showed up at the city gates. Because remember, these guys didn't exactly arrive early in an outbreak. They usually turned up when things were already falling apart, which gave them the same cheerful reputation as a funeral bell or a tax collector. So while some towns hired them with impressive contracts and flowery promises about free housing, hazard pay, and not dying too quickly, plenty of villagers saw them as walking omens of doom, especially since they often traveled in from out of town like freelance grim reapers wearing leather. And let's be honest, nothing says, "Don't worry, everything's fine," like a man in a bird mask carrying a stick and muttering about air quality while your neighbors keep dropping dead. And the children, of course, were terrified of them, because if your entire worldview is goats, bread, and the occasional Saints' Day parade, and suddenly this 6-foot-tall crow person shows up speaking Latin and poking your relatives with a pointy stick, you're probably not sleeping well that night. But even adults sometimes assumed plague doctors brought the disease rather than cured it, because they always appeared during outbreaks like clockwork, strolling in after the rats and before the funerals. So naturally, rumors spread that maybe the guy burning herbs in your living room was actually summoning demons, or poisoning wells, or otherwise involved in some grand cosmic conspiracy, since medieval Europe loved a good conspiracy almost as much as it loved not washing its vegetables. And to be fair, some plague doctors didn't help their own reputations much, because while a few risked their lives honestly treating patients, plenty of others were clearly in it for the money, charging extra fees for house calls, selling miracle cures on the side, or vanishing mid-outbreak the moment things got dangerous, which gave the whole profession a vibe somewhere between brave public servant and snake oil salesman with better branding. And towns noticed, because some surviving contracts include stern warnings about not abandoning your post, not overcharging grieving widows, and not leaving corpses unburied in the streets, which suggests that yes, at least a few plague doctors were pulling exactly those stunts. So it's no wonder medieval artists later painted them as eerie, faceless figures wandering through empty streets, halfway between healer and villain, because depending on who you asked, they were either risking their lives to save the town or just hanging around waiting for inheritances to kick in. And of course, the church had its own opinions, sometimes praising doctors for charity and bravery, other times reminding everyone that only prayer could truly cure plague, which meant the bird-masked fellow handing out emerald smoothies was never going to win a popularity contest with the local priest. Though, to be fair, neither of them had much success stopping the funerals from piling up. Yet despite the suspicions, the fear, and the occasional accusations of sorcery, towns kept hiring them. Partly because what else were they going to do, and partly because the alternative was having no one at all to lance your buboes or write down your symptoms before you died. So plague doctors became this strange medieval paradox. Feared symbols of death, mocked for their outfits, suspected of fraud, but still considered just useful enough to keep around until the rats moved on, the air smelled better, and everyone left alive decided maybe next time they'd wash their hands a bit more often. Which of course they didn't, because Europe went right on having outbreaks for centuries while doctors kept showing up in bird masks like unpaid interns at the apocalypse. And speaking of unpaid interns, let's drift next into how exactly these men were compensated, because the economics of plague doctoring is somehow even weirder than the medicine itself.
All right, let's keep floating down this wonderfully bleak river of history in one long, drowsy breath, and now we drift into the part where plague doctors basically turn death into a business model. Because yes, for a profession that often ended with its employees buried in the very mass graves they were hired to supervise, the economics of plague medicine were surprisingly organized, with contracts spelling out salaries, benefits, and occasionally clauses that read like something from a medieval comedy sketch. So here's how it usually worked. A town facing the apocalypse would scramble to hire the first man willing to wear the beak and poke the sick. And because qualified physicians usually bolted the moment things got messy, they often ended up with wandering freelancers, sometimes real doctors, sometimes barbers with ambition, who demanded payment up front because they correctly guessed the survival rate wasn't great. And contracts often included free housing, food allowances, travel expenses, and, in one memorable case, a place to stay outside the walls so the doctor could avoid sleeping inside the plague zone, which feels like it rather defeated the point, but medieval people loved a good loophole almost as much as they loved not bathing. Some towns even agreed to give plague doctors a share of inheritances from patients who died without heirs, essentially turning the job into a morbid lottery where every new outbreak might mean a surprise cottage or goat herd for the man in the mask, though other contracts went the opposite way, strictly forbidding doctors from accepting bribes or gifts, since desperate families sometimes tried to pay for extra visits while the city council muttered darkly about professionalism and fairness, as though anything about this system screamed professional. And the salaries themselves were all over the place. Some doctors got a few florins a month, others walked away with small fortunes if they lived long enough, since towns would keep sweetening the deal once previous doctors inconveniently died mid-contract, creating a sort of medieval bidding war where surviving candidates could demand better pay, free wine, maybe a house on a hill, while the council nodded nervously because the cemetery workers were already busy enough. But here's the darkly funny part. Plenty of plague doctors never actually finished their contracts because, unsurprisingly, they caught the plague and died. So towns often wrote in clauses promising to pay surviving family members if the doctor didn't make it to payday, which is both practical and very, very depressing, since it basically turned every contract into a polite wager between the city treasury and the Black Death about whether the man in the beak would last more than 3 weeks. Meanwhile, some plague doctors managed to get rich precisely because they avoided doing too much, showing up,
keeping records, maybe visiting a few patients while mostly staying indoors with the good wine until the worst passed, then collecting their salary and strolling off to the next town like medieval consultants billing by the hour. And you have to imagine at least a few local taxpayers grumbling about this while they buried half their neighbors, because nothing builds civic resentment like watching the guy in the leather mask buy nicer boots while prescribing rose water for a disease that killed half the village. And yet, for all the suspicion, towns kept paying because the presence of a plague doctor at least looked like someone was doing something, even if the actual medical advice boiled down to burn some herbs, try not to be sad, and avoid the bad air. Which probably worked about as well as shouting at the clouds, but at least gave everyone a sense of order amid the chaos. And as outbreaks kept returning across the centuries, the contracts got weirder, with some towns requiring plague doctors to stay celibate, others demanding daily death counts like grim little weather reports, and one even specifying that the doctor had to carry a white stick so people could identify him from a safe distance, as though the 6-foot leather bird mask wasn't already a subtle hint. But medieval Europe loved bureaucracy almost as much as it loved not washing its vegetables. So paperwork piled up while patients piled higher. And somewhere in the middle stood the plague doctor, part public servant, part entrepreneur, part scapegoat whenever things inevitably went wrong, which of course they always did. And speaking of things going wrong, let's drift next into how the church and the so-called learned physicians reacted to these beak-wearing freelancers barging into their territory, because nothing says medieval medicine like academics and clergy arguing about who gets to misdiagnose the apocalypse first.
All right, let's keep drifting down this river of historical absurdity. And now we float into the part where the plague doctors start ruffling feathers. Not just the literal feathers stuffed into their masked beaks, but the metaphorical ones belonging to the serious medical establishment and, of course, the church. Because medieval Europe was basically a giant Venn diagram where religion, medicine, and superstition overlapped until no one could quite remember where science ended and divine punishment began. And the arrival of these beak-wearing freelancers wandering into town with contracts and travel stipends annoyed all the right people. University-trained physicians who had spent years memorizing Latin translations of Galen while safely diagnosing constipation in dukes sneered at plague doctors as unschooled quacks, while secretly refusing to go anywhere near plague victims themselves, which made the whole hierarchy feel a bit like watching firefighters mock the guy with a bucket for not having a degree while they themselves stand very far from the burning building. The church, meanwhile, had its own opinions, since priests had long been the default spiritual first responders during outbreaks, offering blessings, last rites, and the occasional stern lecture about how the plague was obviously God's punishment for sins ranging from gambling to wearing excessively pointy shoes. And along came plague doctors with their leather masks and fee schedules, offering what looked suspiciously like practical help. Well, as practical as rosewater enemas and instructions to burn incense could be. And some clergy grumbled that this smelled of pride and possibly heresy, while others were just grateful someone else was finally touching the sick. University physicians, for their part, spent the 14th and 15th centuries writing very long plague treatises full of astrology charts and bad air theories, insisting that only they understood the true causes of the disease, which, to be fair, they didn't. But it didn't stop them from issuing elaborate instructions about the movement of planets, the direction of winds, and the moral dangers of bathing too much. While plague doctors mostly nodded, prescribed more flowers, and tried not to die before payday. The rivalry occasionally got personal, with city councils hiring plague doctors over the objections of university-trained physicians who warned darkly that amateurs would ruin everything, as though things weren't already extremely ruined. And meanwhile, the church kept layering on its own advice: pray more, sin less, maybe go on a procession if you felt brave. So the average plague victim ended up surrounded by a leather-masked doctor muttering about bad air, a priest blaming their drinking habits, and a scholar calculating planetary alignments, all while their neighbors nailed shut the front door.
which must have been a wonderfully soothing environment for the dying. And yet, despite all this professional bickering, plague doctors kept showing up because towns kept hiring them, partly for the medical theater of it all, partly because someone had to count the bodies, and partly because university physicians preferred staying alive to proving their superiority in person. So the man in the beak slowly became a permanent, if unofficial, part of Europe's medical landscape, much to the irritation of the scholars who kept insisting that real medicine happened in Latin, indoors, very far from actual patients. And just to make things even messier, some plague doctors started writing their own treatises, full of cheerful advice about air purification, prayer schedules, and the dangers of eating too many figs during an outbreak, which drove the medical faculty of Paris absolutely insane, because nothing ruins academic dignity like a leather-masked freelancer publishing a bestseller about how to survive divine punishment. And by the time the dust, or rather the infectious particles, finally settled, the church, the scholars, and the plague doctors had all managed to dislike one another equally, while the plague itself carried on cheerfully, ignoring them all. Which feels like the right moment to float over into how ordinary people actually viewed these bird-masked figures wandering through their streets, because public opinion, as always, had its own flavor of chaos.
All right, let's keep drifting through this fog of medieval misery. And now we slide into the part where ordinary people, the ones doing most of the dying, start forming opinions about the men in the bird masks. Because nothing in human history ever arrives without somebody immediately spreading rumors about it. And the plague doctor was basically a walking invitation for gossip. Imagine the scene. Your neighbors are coughing themselves into an early grave, the air smells like bad incense and worse sanitation, and here comes a tall figure in a long black coat, gloves, boots, and a leather mask shaped like a bird head, carrying a wooden stick to poke at patients from a safe distance. And naturally, people have thoughts, most of them unflattering, because medieval Europe loved a good conspiracy almost as much as it hated washing its hands. Some townsfolk decided the doctors were actually spreading the plague on purpose, either as part of a vast government plot, a secret guild of poisoners, or possibly Satan himself running a side hustle. And when the mortality rate didn't improve, these suspicions hardened faster than stale bread, leading to the occasional mob deciding that maybe the Birdman with the stick was the real problem here, not the mountains of unburied rats in the streets. Others just thought plague doctors were creepy, which, to be fair, they were. The mask alone looked like a carnival costume designed by someone who hated joy. And the fact that many doctors barely spoke to patients while scribbling notes and demanding payment only added to the impression that these guys were either mystical healers or lunatics with clipboards. In some regions, stories circulated that plague doctors were performing strange experiments, collecting body parts or hoarding secret cures, none of which was true, since most were barely keeping themselves alive with cheap wine and good luck. But rumor never needs evidence, especially in a century where people blamed everything from astrology to garlic prices for the apocalypse. Occasionally, the accusations got ugly, with whispers that plague doctors were in league with Jewish communities, witches, or foreign enemies, basically the usual medieval suspects. And this sometimes ended in violence, because nothing says public health crisis like people chasing the only semi-medical professional out of town with sticks. Yet at the same time, there were townsfolk who treated plague doctors with near religious awe, convinced the mask and robes had magical protective powers, and some even copied bits of the outfit for themselves, wandering around in makeshift leather hoods like budget versions of the professionals, which must have looked ridiculous but probably didn't feel any less safe than burning lavender on your windowsill. And of course, because humans will monetize anything, some opportunists started dressing up as plague doctors to scare people, rob houses, or sell fake cures, which did not exactly help the profession's public image. So by the 15th century, the plague doctor had become a sort of walking contradiction,
feared yet respected, mocked yet paid, rumored to be both savior and villain while mostly just trying to survive long enough to collect a salary. And since public opinion is never satisfied, towns kept demanding more miracles from men armed with little more than herbs, masks, and mild optimism, while quietly blaming them for every patient who didn't recover, which seems like the perfect time to float into the next chapter of this slow, strange saga, the actual medicine plague doctors used on their patients. Because if you thought the masks were weird, wait until you hear about the treatments.
All right, let's keep floating through the medieval fever dream, and now we reach the part where plague doctors start treating people, or at least performing something that could generously be called treatment if you squinted hard enough. Because remember, this was centuries before germ theory, so medicine was basically a chaotic cocktail of superstition, astrology, and whatever herbs were cheapest at the market that week. And the result was a medical landscape where serious men in long robes prescribed things like rubbing onions on your armpits to cure the Black Death with the same confidence modern doctors reserve for antibiotics. The go-to explanation for the plague, according to university scholars who had read far too much Aristotle and not enough reality, was bad air, or miasma, which sounded fancy, but mostly meant the smell of anything unpleasant. So the treatment plan became one long quest to make the air less terrible. Plague doctors stuffed their mask beaks with dried flowers, mint, cloves, and basically anything that grew in a monastery garden, then waved incense around like exorcists on overtime, and advised patients to carry sweet-smelling posies as though lavender might stop their lungs from collapsing, which it did not. Bleeding patients was another favorite because medieval medicine loved the idea that all illnesses were caused by imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So naturally, draining pints of blood from an already dehydrated, feverish plague victim seemed perfectly logical. And when the patient promptly died, the doctor could solemnly declare that at least the humors were now in balance, spiritually speaking. Then there were the poultices, thick pastes of herbs, spices, crushed flowers, and occasionally animal dung, which doctors smeared on the famous black buboes because someone somewhere decided this might draw out the poison, though mostly it just made the patient smell worse, which probably didn't help the whole bad air situation. Other instructions included bathing in vinegar, drinking ground-up emeralds, if you were rich enough to waste jewelry on medical smoothies, and eating a diet heavy on sour or bitter foods because sweetness was suspiciously sinful during epidemics. Some plague doctors even recommended avoiding bathing entirely since hot water might open the pores and invite in the bad air. So people sat through Europe's deadliest epidemic, unwashed, terrified, and reeking of garlic poultices, which can't have improved morale. Astrology made frequent appearances too, with treatises solemnly explaining that certain planetary alignments had cursed humanity, so treatment often came with helpful advice like don't get sick during a Mars-Saturn conjunction, which must have been comforting for the already infected. Occasionally, doctors prescribed theriac, an ancient cure-all made of dozens of ingredients, including opium, myrrh, cinnamon, and viper flesh, boiled together for months like the world's worst tea. And because it was expensive and disgusting, people assumed it must be effective, though the plague cheerfully ignored it. All this was delivered with straight-faced authority by plague doctors who were often learning on the job, quoting medical texts written centuries earlier by men who thought fevers came from swamp vapors and that sneezing expelled demons. So the entire treatment experience was a sort of medieval theater: herbs, prayers, bleeding, incense, star charts, ending with the same depressing result, because of course it did. And yet people kept calling plague doctors back, kept hiring them, kept hoping this time the onion poultice or the ground-up emeralds might work. Because when half your town is dead, even the guy with the bird mask and the leeches starts to look like a plan. Which feels like the right moment to drift into what happened after the visits. Because plague doctors weren't just treating patients, they were also keeping records. And those records became their own kind of grim legacy.
All right, Let's keep drifting through this medieval haze, and now we come to the part where plague doctors, between stuffing their masks with rosemary and smearing questionable poultices on dying neighbors, ended up becoming the reluctant record keepers of Europe's biggest catastrophe. Because when you hire someone to poke at the sick and count the dead, eventually you want numbers, and medieval governments loved numbers almost as much as they loved taxes. So, along with trying not to inhale too much bad air, plague doctors were often told to keep meticulous notes on who had the plague, when they died, what symptoms they had, and sometimes even what treatments were tried. Basically, medieval spreadsheets, except written on parchment and with handwriting that looked like it had been done during an earthquake. The result is that much of what we actually know about the Black Death, its speed, its mortality rate, its horrifying ability to revisit towns like an unwanted dinner guest, comes from these weary men with their bird masks and quills, trudging door to door while noting things like, Day 3, patient has swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, prognosis, extremely bad, though probably in more Latin and less sarcasm. Some plague doctors went above and beyond, producing long, gloomy chronicles describing entire neighborhoods turning silent overnight, the smell of hastily dug graves, the eerie sight of towns where only cats seemed to be thriving, because of course they were. And while they weren't exactly writing with Shakespearean flair, their observations turned into the raw material later historians would use to piece together what actually happened. Interestingly, these records also show that plague doctors were sometimes too earnest for local authorities, because nobody wants to read, half the town is dead and the rest are fleeing when you're trying to maintain public order, so some city councils politely suggested that maybe the doctors could soften the numbers a bit, or at least stop writing things like, all is lost in the margins. Yet, despite the gloom, this record-keeping gave plague doctors a strange sort of legacy. Yes, people blamed them when treatments failed, suspected them of witchcraft, or occasionally chased them out with pitchforks. But centuries later, histories lean heavily on their notes to understand how the plague moved, how people reacted, and how spectacularly medieval medicine failed to stop it. And in a weird twist, some plague doctors even started giving advice based on their data, producing early public health recommendations like burn the clothes of the dead, avoid strangers, and don't pile corpses next to drinking water, which sounds obvious now, but was cutting-edge wisdom in the 14th century. Of course, whether anyone followed this advice is another matter, since towns were busy blaming comets, foreigners, and possibly bad cheese for the apocalypse. But at least the doctors were trying, in between bleeding patients and selling Theriac. So while plague doctors may not have cured anyone, they accidentally became the chroniclers of Europe's worst pandemic, their ink-stained hands leaving behind centuries of data that future scientists, scholars, and morbidly curious YouTubers would obsess over. And this feels like the right moment to drift toward the part where plague doctors themselves start disappearing, because the job, as you might imagine, wasn't exactly a long-term career choice.
All right, let's just keep floating forward through the medieval fog. And now we arrive at the part where plague doctors themselves start quietly vanishing from the records. Because here's the thing, being a plague doctor was not exactly a stable career. In the same way, standing in a lightning storm holding a metal pole is not technically a long-term investment strategy. First of all, the plague did not care that you were wearing a terrifying bird mask stuffed with lavender and cloves, because the beak might have looked like medieval hazmat gear, but it was about as effective as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. So, many plague doctors ended up catching the very disease they were supposedly treating, often within weeks of starting the job. Some cities, realizing this was happening, began offering absurdly generous contracts to lure in new doctors. Free housing, high salaries, tax exemptions, even citizenship, because otherwise no one wanted to sign up for spend your days poking dying people with sticks while wearing a crow costume as their full-time occupation. The contracts often spelled out in hilarious legal detail, things like how many visits the doctor was expected to make per day, how often he was allowed to flee town when things got bad, and whether he was required to treat rich and poor equally. Because of course city councils were worried he might focus on wealthy merchants while leaving the peasants to marinate in buboes.
Some plague doctors did, in fact, survive and moved on to other towns when the plague flared up again, becoming a sort of wandering apocalypse workforce, carrying their bird masks and jars of theriac from one desperate city to another like medieval freelancers with the world's worst resume. But many others simply vanished mid-outbreak, probably buried in the same mass graves as their patients, because protective gear consisted of a leather coat, a stick, and vibes. There are scattered stories of plague doctors getting rich if they lived long enough to collect their salaries, which were often paid in lump sums after the epidemic ended. A cruel little catch, since the epidemic also ended them in many cases, letting city councils quietly keep the money. Because, of course they did. And even for the ones who survived, the job carried a certain awkward stigma afterward, since spending months surrounded by corpses didn't exactly make you a popular dinner guest. So some plague doctors retired into quiet obscurity, their names surviving only in dusty contracts and gloomy chronicles, while others kept working through multiple outbreaks until inevitably their luck ran out. By the 17th century, the iconic beaked costume had become so associated with death that just seeing one of these bird-masked figures in the street sent entire neighborhoods into panic, a sort of medieval jump scare announcing that things were about to go very, very badly. And honestly, the psychological toll on the doctors themselves must have been immense. Walking from house to house, day after day, watching entire families vanish while your treatments failed spectacularly, trying to pretend the mask made you invincible when deep down you knew it didn't. So it's not surprising that many plague doctors ended their lives broke, sick, and largely forgotten, leaving behind nothing but medical notes, terrifying woodcuts, and one of the most accidentally creepy outfits in history. Which feels like the right moment to drift toward the final part of this story, where we look at how plague doctors went from real exhausted men to the bizarre Halloween icon figures we think of today.